In this lecture, we want to take a look at aorist passive participles. This will be lesson number 22 in the textbook. First thing we want to look at is the vocabulary. There's some new words here, and I want to just make sure that you are familiar with pronouncing them. First word is apoluo. Apoluo comes from apa, which would be the preposition, and then luo. So it means I release or I dismiss. So it's called a compound verb because it contains both a participle and also the verb with it. So apoluo. Next word that we have is aspadzomai. Aspadzomai. The D again stands for deponent, which means that it's going to be middle or middle passive in form, but it will be active in its meaning, and it means I greet. Aspadzomai. Next word is epithumia, epithumia, which means I desire or a longing. Followed by that is kairos, kairos means time or season. Loipos, loipos meaning remaining, other, or rest. Makros, makros means blessed or fortunate. Mesos, mesos means middle. Ptokas, ptokas, poor. Sabbaton, sabbaton means the Sabbath or the seventh day. Soteria, soteria is salvation. Kreia is need. Kraionos, kraionos is period of time or time. Hode, hode, you note that this word has a rough breathing mark, so we're going to add the H sound to it. So omega, hode, hode means here, in, or to this place. It's an adverb, so it will not change its form. That is then followed by ora, hora. Again, you have the rough breathing mark indicating the H sound to it. Hora, meaning our moment. That actually sounds like our word our. Hoste, hoste. So that therefore a conjunction, a particle that you'd see in a Greek sentence. Hoste, hoste. With the first aorist passive participles, it's going to be built on the aorist passive stem. If you remember, I made mention of page number 185. That contains a chart very similar to what you see on your screen that gives us the different forms. So we're looking at the very last form, this aorist passive form right here. So we would use these forms right here. So we're using luo as our pattern word. So eluthane, eluthane would be the aorist passive form. The one thing when we're dealing with aorist passive participles is that because we're dealing with a participle, we will not have the augment. So it's basically going to be luth. Luth is going to be the stem that we're going to be working with. And to that stem, we're going to have the third declension masculine neuter and the first declension for the feminine. So luth plus the epsilon, which would be the theme vowel for masculine, or epsilon iota, which would be the theme vowel for feminine. The neuta, which would be the normal sign of the participle. And then the ending, which again would be the third declension for masculine neuter, would be first declension for feminine. So the word here, luthentas, luthentas would be the word here, and this would be an first aorist passive participle. It would be masculine genitive singular. If you look at this slide, it shows you all the various forms of the aorist passive, first aorist passive participles. And as you look, you can see, again, the nominative form is going to be a little different. It's not going to have the new tau with it. It does have the epsilon. So using the same third declension endings, luthes, luthentas, luthenti, luthenta. For the feminine, you don't have the new ta with it. You have the epsilon, iota, and then the sigma. So luthesai, luthesai, lutheses, luthese, luthesan, which would be feminine, and neuter is very similar to what we would have for the masculine. So those would be the forms. Once again, notice that the dative form begins, or ends, I should say, with a iota, indicating the data. You have the iota subscript, so whenever you see a iota subscript, that should help you to identify that you have either a dative singular or a dative plural form. And these are the plural forms of the same aorist participle. These are all the first aorist passive participle of luo. And once again, you can see with the plural, you have, for the nominative, you have the nu tau here, all the way through. The only form that's unique is that dative plural. In this way, the dative plural looks a little bit more like what we would have for the feminine plural. And so just a matter of getting familiar with these endings. Again, that nu tau should help us to see that we're dealing with an aorist participle. Now, normally the nu tau indicates an active participle, but in this case we're dealing with a passive participle because we're dealing with the first aorist. If we're dealing with second aorist, remember second aorist has a different stem to it, so this is a pattern of apostello, and you can see the variations that we would have with this. Again, you have that same form, the epsilon, the nu tau omicron sigma for the genitive form, and then the shortened form without that nu tau for the nominative or the vocative forms. And again, using the third declension endings for masculine, the second declension endings for the feminine, and the third declension endings for the neuter as well. There's a construction in Greek which is called the genitive absolute, and this is dealing with participles. Essentially, when you have a genitive absolute, it's a construction in the New Testament that consists of a participle, a noun or pronoun in the genitive case that are loosely connected with the remaining sentence. So the way you'll have this, the way you can identify if you have this, is if you have a participle that is in the genitive case. That could be a genitive absolute. It's not going to really affect the meaning too much, but it's just something that will help you as you're trying to translate that particular form. In a genitive absolute, the subject of the main verb is different from the noun or the pronoun that we'll find within the participle. And let me give you an example of this. And again, this is just something that occasionally you'll see. It's not too frequent, but if you have a participle and the participle's in the genitive case, you might be dealing with something that is a genitive absolute. So if we look at the example here, the normal use of a genitive, we would have a situation right here. So we have epe ontes, and you can see again that we have the nu tau and the epsilon sigma as our ending. So this indicates that we have a participle. This particular participle here, as we parse it out, would be aorist active participle, plural nominative masculine, from epon. Epon would be the word. And in this case, epon means to say. So when we translate this one, again, it's in the genitive form of the participle. And so as we're translating this, we're going to just identify this as a temporal clause. Again, the participle is by itself. So we're going to create a temporal clause. When they said, so again, this dealing with the participle, they said, tauta, these things. So when they said these things, the apostles went away. So the participle here is referring to a verb that is in the plural, so in this case the apostles. So when the apostles said these things, the apostles went away is essentially what we're saying, but we're using a pronoun here. So when they said these things, the apostles went away. And that's the normal use of a genitive. Now let's compare it to a genitive absolute this time. So we have a slightly different sentence, but we have a participle that begins with this one. Legontas, the omicron sigma, again, is the third declension ending, so this would be genitive singular. So from lego means to say or speak. So once again, it's by itself, so we're going to translate it by using a temporal clause. While he was saying tauta these things, so while he, now notice our pronoun. We have a third person personal pronoun, singular, and so we'd say while he was saying these things. The main verb of this sentence is apelthon, And the way we'd parse this, it could actually be aorist active indicative, third person plural, or it could be aorist active indicative, first person singular. We're going to take this as a first person singular to demonstrate this genitive absolute case. And notice how, again, we have the participle, legantas, autu, so he, and this is going to be genitive singular, so he, while he was saying these things. And now we have apelthen, and we are parsing this as aorist active indicative, first person singular, so we'd say, I went away. So notice the he and the I don't really match together, unlike the they and the apostles. So when the apostles said these things, they went away. But while he was saying these things, I went away. So we would refer to this as a genitive absolute. There's really not a connection, direct connection between the first clause and the second clause. So while he was saying these things, so this person was saying these things, and it just is giving me the time that I went away during that particular point. You occasionally see these, but again, you're going to have a participle, and that participle will be in the genitive case, and it won't have a direct connection with the rest of the sentence. So we would just refer to this as a genitive absolute. You don't necessarily need to know that when you're trying to translate, but it does help to know that these genitive absolutes don't have a direct connection to the other clause that they're part of. They have more of a loose connection with it because of the subject matter that's being identified. So let's look at the function of the aorist passive participle. First of all, when we talk about an aorist passive participle, it expresses action that is antecedent to the main verb, similar to the aorist participles. So again, we have an aorist tense, and an aorist tense is a past time tense. So you think about it, if we have our present time, aorist would indicate time that would be past time, so time that would be prior to that time. So when we're dealing with the aorist passive participles, remember the participle doesn't have the time or doesn't have time in itself. It relies upon the time of the main verb, and so it's either going to be antecedent, it's going to be prior to the time of the main verb, it's going to be at the exact same time of the main verb, or it's going to be after the time of the main verb when we're dealing with the future. So an aorist participle would be time that is antecedent to the main verb. The passive voice indicates that the subject is receiving the action as opposed to the subject is actually performing the action. And the action, as we talk about aorist, is what's referred to as undefined. It's just simple action. It's just action that's happened. We're not looking at action that's in a progress, so we're not showing the progress of action that's happened over a period of time in the past time, but we're looking at just simply undefined, just simple action that has occurred. Let's take a look at this sentence to illustrate the function of the aorist passive participles. We have a verb that's highlighted in red right here, koluthentes, and this word here means to hinder or to refuse. The lexical form is koluo, to hinder or to refuse. We would parse this participle as an aorist passive participle, plural nominative masculine. And so as we see the participle, the way we're going to translate it, again, is using the word when. We could also use the word after. So if we just look at the translation of the sentence, but when or now, they went through Perga and Galatia regions, or the regions of Perga and Galatians, when they had been forbidden, or after they had been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And so what we're doing here is we're trying to show that this is antecedent to the time of the main verb. So the main verb is that they went through the region of Perga and Galatia. That happened after they had been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to go to Asia. So the idea of the aorist passive participle is that, first of all, it's dealing with time that's antecedent to the main verb, or time that's prior to the time of the main verb. So we could translate this as either when they had been forbidden or after they had been forbidden. And notice that we are dealing with a passive voice. when they had been forbidden. So it's not the subject actually doing the action, but the subject is being acted upon. So they had been forbidden. And so we get those two ideas with regard to this, the aorist passive participles. It's action that is antecedent or prior to the time of the main verb, and is also dealing with an action that is in the passive voice. Something is acting upon the subject in this particular sentence. Just to mention another thing that is mentioned in the textbook is the accusative as subject of the infinitive. Greek has a widely used idiom that has the subject of the sentence or clause in the accusative case, and the verb appears as an infinitive. Some grammars refer to this as the accusative of general reference or accusative of reference, but in practice it's a subject accusative. So we have an accusative that is functioning as a subject of the infinitive. Normally we would have the nominative, but in this case we have the we have the accusative form as a subject. So here's a sentence that we have an example that we can demonstrate. And you can see that we have the infinitive pathein. Pathein is our infinitive. And as we have our infinitive, we have our subject, in this case may. Now if you remember, may is the accusative form of that personal pronoun, the first person personal pronoun. And so that's acting as the subject. We would translate this last part, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Now, Greek has a unique way of looking at its infinitives. Typically in English, if we have the infinitive, we have a to, and then we have a word. So to suffer, or to run, or to go. And we normally just have that to suffer would be our infinitive. But in this case, it's not going to really make much sense if we identify it that way. So sometimes we have to take this translation and understand it from the standpoint of how the Greek language works. So the infinitive is to suffer, and we're dealing with reference to me to suffer is the idea. Or before I suffer would be another idea with this. And so we have to try to understand the language and how it's set up the structure, and we can't just try to translate an infinitive just like we would in English. We have to understand the Greek infinitive. So we'll talk a little bit more about infinitives in in a few more lessons, but just that you identify this one idiom that we have of the infinitive that has an accusative as its subject. Let's take a look at the exercises to show another example of how to translate these aorist passive participles. If you look at sentence number 2, the first word is our participle. It's eis elthon tone. That comes from the word es erchomai. Remember, erchomai is one of those terms that changes quite drastically in its stem from tense to tense. In this case, we would parse it as an aorist active participle, plural genitive masculine. Aorist active participle, plural genitive masculine. So as we translate that participle, we would say that we understand this as an aorist passive participle. So we want to use a temporal clause with this. So we'd say something like after the disciples, tone, mathe tone, after the disciples entered into the boat. So after the disciples entered into the boat. So that's giving us the time, and that's compared to the time of our main verb, ap elthen, which comes from the word ap erchomai, which means to go away. That would be parsed as aorist active indicative, third person singular. So after the disciples entered into the boat, the Lord went out to the mountain. The Lord went out to or into the mountain. And so once again, we have our participle is acting as more of a temporal clause, helping us to identify the timing of the main verb. So the main verb here, as we have an aorist verb, past time, so Lord went out to the mountain, but when did that occur? Well, it occurred after the disciples had entered into the boat. So it gives you an example of how to translate these participles. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you to understand these aorist passive participles. We have a lot of things that we're trying to juggle around when we're translating these, so we just have to understand, again, how do we translate a participle? What's the sense of the aorist tense? How does that relate to the time of the main verb as we're dealing with a participle as opposed to just a verb? And they do take some time to work through these. Just give you the chance to working through the exercises. If you have some questions, feel free to text me or email me or call me. I'd be glad to work through these participles with you. But I'll try to provide some feedback on your homework to also give you some additional help as you're trying to translate these. Don't worry, don't get discouraged if you have some trouble with translating them at first, but it's more of practice that will help you as you're translating these participles to get the right idea. Thank you for joining us for this video. Have a good day.